I have a great pleasure now introducing Richard Benwell. Richard is Chief Executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link, and we go back quite a way, as I was saying, Richard, and it's great to see the work that you're doing. I'm going to hand over to you to go through a little bit of national context. Richard.
Thanks so much, Robin, and thanks, Megan, for that brilliant and heartfelt speech. And I sort of feel guilty taking you away from puffins and penguins and tigers to policy and politics. So I'm sorry about that, but they do all interconnect. And it was great to receive the invitation for today and to hear that today is all about action and pledges. And that got me thinking about some of the big political pledges that we've seen over recent years. It got me thinking back to 2010 and David Cameron, who pledged to make his the greenest government ever. Then we had Theresa May in 2018, whose 25-year environment plan pledged to hand on nature in better conditions for the next generation. And just last year, in signing the Forest Pledge, the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said he wanted to transform the human race from being conquerors of nature to being custodians of nature. That's quite a big pledge. If only reality followed rhetoric, hey? If only it did, then every inch of England would be an Eden by now. But unfortunately, the actual real world has lagged rather behind the rhetoric. We said we wouldn't hear about those charts of doom today that you've had at conferences past, but it is worth just rehearsing some of the numbers, precisely because of the shifting baseline syndrome that Megan talked about. So we have great records of biodiversity going back to 1970, and at the start of the last decade, when those first pledges were made, our baseline for species abundance in the UK compared with 1970 was 22%. Now, a decade later, it's 17%. I find those numbers almost impossible to believe, but they're not made-up numbers. They're a government indicator. It's the sort of innocuously named indicator D6 that JNCC publishes, but that's a huge and terrible loss of biodiversity in 50 years. It's extraordinary. And unfortunately, in that same period that those pledges were made, policy has also been slow to catch up. So we've spent the last 4 years putting in place 3 new major pieces of legislation. The Agriculture Act, designed largely to replace the Common Agricultural Policy. The Fisheries Act, designed to replace elements of the Common Fisheries Policy. And the Environment Act, which is meant to sort of bring back home accountability and ambition for environmental improvement. And those major pieces of legislation took thousands of hours of parliamentary time, huge amounts of money, vast investment by NGOs. And what do they really do? They bring us back to where we started in many ways. They put in place a domestic platform of legislation to replace what we had in the EU as a starting point for going forward, but they're framework pieces of legislation. And so now is when we come to the fork in the road to determine whether the actual implementation of those big pieces of law leads to a new greener path or heads down old, well-trodden, overly exploitative routes of environmental destruction. And so in the next few minutes, I want to spin through really quickly where we are on each of those major pieces of policy and to think through how we guide the government in the right direction and avoid repeating old mistakes. So first to farming. And the pledge here that came through in the Agriculture Act is a really, really good one. So the Agriculture Act promised to move from a system of subsidies for landowning to a system of payments for public goods. So where we take the same envelope of money that we used to hand out for owning land, about £2.3 billion a year in England, and use it instead to pay for environmental improvement. That's an excellent pledge. Unfortunately, as so often, the pledge hits politics. And particularly at the moment, we're at the risk of slowing down and even turning back. We're in a pretty awful crisis globally, as we know, with what's happening in the Ukraine. And over the last few weeks even, the price of diesel has doubled, the price of fertilizer has tripled, And that adds to already serious problems for farmers in terms of worker shortages post-Brexit and in terms of farm gate prices. And so it's understandable that some people are now calling for a slowdown and a rethink of the turn to environmental action in farming. But that would be a serious mistake. The government's own review last December on food security found that the biggest risks to food security in the UK are, in fact, climate change and biodiversity loss. And instead of delaying, it's precisely because of delay that we find ourselves in the situation we are now. We are at this precipice where some farmers are considering ploughing up their environmental schemes because the government has been really slow in delivering its promises made over 4 years ago to shift to an environmental system of payments. Instead of thinking back and turning back the clock, we should be accelerating our transition to environmental payments. We should be ensuring that imports meet the same standards as domestic products, and we should be making sure that farming budgets continue beyond the end of this Parliament, which is the extent of the government's current commitment. But it goes deeper than that. We're in this situation because of the delays in moving to a more regenerative farming system where we can be more independent in our agriculture. If we were less dependent on fertiliser, then we would have been, the sensible course of action would have been to invest a long time ago in better soil health, in more biodiversity, and improving our regenerative farming system. So we've come to a point now where the answer is surely for farmers and environmentalists to stand together and to call for the government to go faster and further in guaranteeing budgets and shifting to a new system. So there we are on farming. Quickly on fisheries. And again, here we have some excellent promises. The government has promised to protect 30% of the ocean for nature. It's promised to achieve environmental recovery in our seas. And we've seen some fantastic reviews. So a couple of years ago, we had Lord Benyon's review of highly protected marine areas, which for the first time promised to turn some of our marine protected area network into highly protected marine areas, places for nature to recover, to become sort of arcs of abundance that would help the environment and fishermen alike. And we've also had promises like the new powers in the Fisheries Act to create new English bylaws that could, for example, help us to curb the worst excesses of the industrial fishing fleet, bottom trawling in our marine protected areas. These are really good, but they're still waiting in the wings. And this time, the pledge runs up against the politics of energy security. And this one's really heartbreaking for an environmentalist, actually, because one of the biggest tensions we see is between the pledge to do ocean recovery and the Prime Minister's pledge to make the UK the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. We, of course, should be investing hugely in marine renewables resources, not just wind. But we have to do it in a better way. At the moment, we're still in the balmy situation, I think, where each individual project is assessed on the basis of its own footprint. It doesn't take into account cumulative pressures of fishing, environment and infrastructure. And I think we're still in a situation, some of the industrial folk in the room will correct me if I'm wrong, where each project has to have its own individual grid connection rather than sensible strategic planning. So there's a huge task for the government now in taking a more sensible, joined-up strategic approach to planning at sea so that we can deliver those ocean recovery pledges and the hugely important action for energy security and for net zero of rolling out offshore wind and renewables. And finally, to turn to the Environment Act. And this was a humongous act. I don't know whether anybody has taken the plunge of reading it. It's brain-bogglingly huge, so I won't try and go through all of it now. But there is one area where the sort of pledges and politics bang up against each other again that I just wanted to hone in on, and that's the politics of deregulation and development. The Environment Act promised to do some pretty exciting things on planning. For the first time, DEFRA was allowed to delve into DLUC and start to talk about how we do housing, how we do development. And it promised two big things: net gain for housing and development, so every new development would have to do more for nature than the harm it causes, and creating local nature recovery strategies, these bottom-up plans for mapping out the best areas for nature to recover. Both of those things are excellent. We won some battles in the bill and we lost some battles. So unfortunately, net gain is just 10%. Unfortunately, the habitat only needs to last for 30 years. but still it's pretty good. Now there are some really big consultations ahead on how we actually do it, and possibly the most critical thing is making sure that local authorities have the capacity and the wherewithal to check that what's promised by a developer is actually delivered and maintained for those decades it's promised for. So that's something that I hope all of the local authority folk will help us to do in the consultation in the next months ahead, to make sure that that monitoring and accountability of the promises are actually delivered. And on local nature recovery strategies, what a great idea. Fantastic plan. Unfortunately, the legal duty to actually use local nature recovery strategies is utterly feeble. It's a duty to have regard to them. And so there's a huge job as we go through implementation to make sure that those strategies are linked into planning and spending decisions by you guys from the bottom up. And those hit up against some big political agendas of housing targets, which still drive so many decisions, 300,000 homes a year, and with the urge to deregulate. Just last week, the government published a new Nature Green Paper. It's called a Nature Recovery Green Paper. And in it, the government proposes to review our most important conservation laws, the habitats regulations that derived from the Birds and Habitats directives that have underpinned site protection for so long. And in particular, it's looking at things like the habitats regulations assessments, which are the ways of checking that new developments, plans and projects don't cause significant harm to protected sites. And we know in particular, the government has its sights on things like nutrient pollution, which holds back housing development where we reach critical thresholds of pollution in rivers and streams. It's only those laws that stop extra development adding to the load of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that's killing our rivers. So we need to make sure that the Nature Recovery Green Paper really lives up to its name. But I just want to finish on one final bit of the Environment Act that maybe gives us hope, and it's a pledge of a different sort. So the headline of the Environment Act was to set legally binding targets for air, water, waste and wildlife. Last week, the government set out its targets for doing so, and there were some really big gaps. There is no targets for the condition and extent of our protected areas. There is no target for the actual condition of our rivers and streams beyond 2027. There is no target for reducing the amount of material use we extract and use as an economy. These are major gaps, but there is one fantastic target in the Environment Act that we won thanks to you guys. And that is the legal commitment to restore nature, to turn around that decline I talked about before by 2030. The government is legally obliged to halt the decline of biodiversity by 2030. And that's a pledge of a different sort. It's a pledge in law that if the government fails, we can take them to court for. And it's a pledge that was won because 200,000 people and lots of the organisations in this room campaigned for it, with parliamentarians from all across both houses in Parliament last year. It was a fantastic win. And I guess my pledge today is that we mustn't forget about that. Megan talked before about how so often we get these big wins and then we forget about them and we come back a while later and sort of like to wring our hands in horror. We mustn't do that with this big pledge. We need to turn this big pledge into what's really a net zero for nature. And that means giving it parliamentary, public and press attention for the next 8 years, so the government has to use that as a benchmark for decision making across all those other things. And if you're in the position to do so, please, if you're thinking about your net zero plans as a business, include as part of it 2030 nature recovery as part of your business plans. If you're a local authority, if you're declaring a climate emergency and net zero, include nature's recovery by 2030. And if you're an NGO, let's use that 2030 promise as a chance to check that on agriculture we go the right direction. Is it in line with 2030? Yes or no? On marine, is it in line with 2030? Yes or no? On development, is it in line with 2030? Yes or no? So that's my pledge to you today. I'm going to use the 2030 as a benchmark to hold government to account on those big promises for the next decade. And who knows, if we get it right, maybe it will be the greenest government ever.
Richard, fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. And we were one of the pilots for the local nature recovery strategies in Cornwall. Scilly, we're working with as well. And actually, one of the fights that we had there was to include marine as part of that plan, which DEFRA weren't too keen about. But we're determined that that's as important to do that. And thank you very much indeed for that pledge. I think that's what we're going to look forward. I'd love to think that we not just stop the decline, we managed to stop the decline before that and move forward, but at least we have that as a legal requirement. Okay, we're going to have a questions and answers. Megan, would you like to come back up? Pip, I think we're going to need a... Yeah, I'll leave this for you to between the two. We also, the other thing I haven't mentioned is we have a great turnout here at Heartlands, but we also have a number of people joining us by Zoom as well. So we're going to try to also have questions. If you're on Zoom and listening to the conference, you're as welcome as everybody here. And please, if there's questions you want to ask, please do that. If I could ask people to introduce themselves, and then I'll leave it to Megan and to Richard to decide how they want to answer the questions. But yes, please, yes. If you'd like to stand up. So, and we need to have a... Pip, are you able to take, or someone is able to take a microphone around? Well, just let's do it from the. Can we do it? Is it working, the microphone? Because otherwise people can't hear us. Let's get the techies here. We'll try to sort it out.
Hi, thanks very much for this talk. That's brilliant. So the theme of the day, motivating and moving forward, which you have done. That's fantastic. So I think adaptation and mitigation needs to be greater than the risks faced, the risks that we've talked about so far. And a bit like recycling, I think we need to close the loop. And I just wondered, Megan, is it at all possible, and Richard as well, to include in the story closing the loop? So when we're talking about all these things, if we can make it easy for the layperson to relate these stories with their daily life, so perhaps about how you offset where you go, and no criticism where you're going, but to actually let that householder in that span of concentration understand how they can cut their emissions as well, because you're so influential. Thank you.
I think that's a really, really good point, and that's something that I try and do all the time. I try and build up a platform. It's essentially what I do every day, whether that's on kind of social media. I try and call myself a science communicator more than a TV presenter or anything else like that, because that's ultimately what it is. I'm trying to explain often quite complicated science in a way that is digestible, but also one which isn't kind of as depressing as perhaps it can be. But you're also trying to, you're trying to make sure that, we're honest and we are open with the issues going on. But as important as it is to talk about those issues, it's more important to be talking about the solutions and making those solutions, available for everybody. And sometimes that can be, quite tricky. I think sometimes to be green, we're all very lucky to be able to be green, because it is a bit of a luxury at times. And I think we need to have more open communication about how we can make those green solutions more accessible to, everybody, whether, you live in the heart of London, or rural communities, wherever you are, making nature accessible, but also those solutions. It's something that I look into for myself. I know you said there about kind of travelling and offsetting, and it's something that personally I'm critically aware of. A lot of my travelling I did before the age of, I haven't done much other than that South Africa trip I mentioned. I haven't done very much in the last few years, obviously with COVID and everything else. But I'm looking at ways for carbon offsetting, and sometimes I find carbon offsetting a little bit confusing. Obviously on airlines and stuff, and you tick that box to carbon offset, but actually how good is that? Thank you, because I don't know the best thing, always to do, because there is a lot of greenwashing. So I think we've got to hold those industry levels, organisations, everything accountable for making those solutions as obvious and clear as possible, because there's a lot of kind of greenwashing, and I know that term can be quite difficult. but to just be transparent with what those solutions can be, because it can be overly complicated, I would say.
Richard, quick comment.
Good, very good point. I guess the other side of the coin is we should make it as easy as possible for people to be able to do their thing, and that's where it comes back to government. It's balmy that it is more expensive to take the environmental choice than the easy, cheap, world-destroying choice. So with things like spring statements and budgets and taxes, we should be loading the dice so that when people go to the supermarket shelves, they can pick the organic choice off the shelf, knowing that it's both more affordable and better for the world, for example. And that's the other side of closing the loop, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Pete, would you like to, I think you can speak out one of the questions that's come from our Zoom participants.
There's a lot of questions coming in, but obviously we're short on time. So there's just one here, Megan, from Sarah O'Brien, which is targeted to yourself. It's a nice one, but what wildlife would you like to see returning or arriving in Cornwall in the future if we get nature recovery right?
It's a very tricky question. There's lots of things that I would like to see returning. There's lots of new things turning up, which is, interesting, I suppose, and it's always a treat to see new things coming in. Obviously, kind of worrying about kind of should they be here and are they in the right place at the right time and how that's going to impact our native wildlife. But in terms of a return, I mean, I'm really a big fan of marine life. Ever since I started working, with sharks, I just became a little bit obsessed by the whole thing, if I'm honest. I know sharks have faced a 70% decline in the last 100 years, so I would like to see kind of more concerted effort in our marine regions to kind of protect these species. Obviously, we saw photos of the blue sharks, a pelagic species that like the open water. They're one of the most widespread species that we have anywhere around the world. But, I'd love spiny dogfish to come back. I'd love to see a spiny dogfish in real life and not wrapped up in a bit of fish and chip shop newspaper, to be perfectly honest with you, because that's, I think, probably the closest I might ever get to one, which is really sad. So I'd like to see more concerted effort for our cetaceans and elasmobranchs, I suppose.
Any favourites, Richard, to come back?
I'd like the clouds. To me, it's more important to get those clouds of butterflies that you were talking about before, and to just get the abundance and the joy of richness rather than necessarily one or two charismatic species. But spiny dogfish sound cool.
They're really pretty.
Okay. Let's, I'd like, we're tight for time as Pip reminds me, but I'd like to take another one from the audience here if anybody has, yes please, yes. Would you like to stand up? We'll give you a microphone if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, David Smith. So question for Richard. With the government pledge to 2030, what happens with the change of government? Will the current holders be pursued if they sleep on their watch? And where's the responsibility lie?
Really good question, and the power of these new frameworks is that they do span different governments and attempt to break that short-termism of electoral cycles. But one of the things that we didn't win in the passage of the Act was to have legally binding milestones along the way so that you could get that short-term accountability. And that's why we have to do that job. So we need to make sure that we are the ones who make it as visible if the indicator isn't turning around, if the government isn't taking the critical steps it needs to each year, that it becomes a question of political accountability. So there will be some mechanisms. The new Office for Environmental Protection will report every year on how the government's doing, but that won't be enough. Unless people really get this idea that we now have a net zero for nature, that we have a deadline where the government's got to do something by, then you're right. Present generation could once again wriggle out and leave it until it's too late for someone to pick up the pieces. So it's up to us.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw it to an end there. My apologies to Pip. We've got a number of questions there, have we? But we'll have to do them maybe at another time or find another way of doing that. Megan, Richard, thanks so much indeed.